Goddamn, I haven't uploaded in so long, it's insane.
The 80s were an interesting time for music. Coming out of the 70s, disco was dead, punk was evolving into post-punk, hardcore, and new wave, and new wave British heavy metal was kicking off bands like Saxon, Judas Priest, Motorhead, and Iron Maiden. The most commercially successful form of metal in the 80s, and pretty much rock music in general, was hair metal. Now here's the thing, despite its name, is hair metal really metal? Well, that's what this video is going to answer. But in order to determine that, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the history of hair metal, and we're going to discuss the genre's origins and where it stemmed from. Let's go. So hair metal, also known as glam metal, is a style of hard rock and heavy metal that is really known for its pop-influenced songwriting, or traditional song structures, catchy sing-along choruses, along with every band ever having at least one extremely unbearably cheesy power ballad. Anyway, the genre mainly evolved from glam rock and arena rock in the 70s and the new wave of British heavy metal in the early 80s. 70s glam bands and acts such as David Bowie, Sweet, Slade, T-Rex, the New York Dolls, and maybe considered glam rock, but Boston and Cheap Trick were heavily influenced from the genre, along with early metal bands like the Scorpions, and yes, Scorpions are metal, and shock rock acts like Kiss and Alice Cooper. Aerosmith in particular would have a few hits in the 70s, then kind of fade away, and then would make one of the biggest comebacks in the history of music when hair metal became mainstream, of which Aerosmith was definitely considered a huge influence. It was Van Halen in the late 70s, with their self-titled debut album, that really came to define what glam metal would be, and really set the stage, or the scene, or the blueprint overall for what the genre would sound like. In the early 80s, the new wave of British heavy metal was exploding, and one of the bands of that movement, Def Leppard, didn't really like to be categorized as heavy metal. As such, they shot for a more mainstream arena/hard rock sound, and became huge with their albums Pyromania and Hysteria. Both went multi-platinum and are some of the most successful, best-selling albums of the 80s. And this was one of the first instances of hair metal blowing up in the early mid-80s, bands like Motley Crue, Rat, Quiet Riot, Twisted Sister, and Dokken becoming insanely popular. The genre's popularity continued throughout the rest of the 80s. Bon Jovi blew up their album Slippery When Wet, along with Guns N' Roses, Poison, Cinderella, Skid Row, and Warrant all becoming mainstream and having album sales that were going through the roof. Glam metal also had some bands that weren't as popular, such as Night Ranger, Finland's Hanoi Rocks, Slaughter, and a little band from Texas called Pantera. Pantera would change their sound and meet completely to groove/thrash metal and become one of the biggest metal bands in the 90s, but that's for another video. Hair metal continued into the very early 90s, but really didn't last much longer than that. Alt-rock broke in the late 80s with bands like Jane's Addiction, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Nine Inch Nails, although Nine Inch Nails in particular is more industrial than anything. Either way, these were the bands that were sort of gaining momentum and gaining steam and kind of hitting the charts. Then it was around 1991 and 1992 that grunge broke out, and right in that moment, hair metal was dead. Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains, bands that were all heavily influenced by the Melvins, were ruling the charts. Hair metal has never really been revived since. I mean, there have been a couple bands here and there that have tried to revive that sound, like Darkness and Steel Panther, and Steel Panther in particular doing it in a sort of comedic way where they don't really take themselves too seriously, and they're a fun band. But hair metal has not, and probably will not, reach the commercial heights that it did in the 80s. So to answer the question, is hair metal really metal? Well, honestly, with genres like this, I think it's really up to personal opinion. And personally, for me, I think it really depends on the band, but I would say that hair metal is not metal. Bands like Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, Poison, Cinderella, Skid Row, Van Halen, and even GNR have much more in common with arena rock and glam rock, and overall I would define these bands as strictly hard rock and not metal. But I will argue that there are a few exceptions to this. In particular, three bands, maybe there's a couple more, but Motley Crue, Quiet Riot, and Twisted Sister. Quiet Riot and the rest of these bands, I would argue, have a bit more of a metal edge and a heavier sound. I mean, Quiet Riot had a song and album called Metal Health, and they had Randy Rhoads for crying out loud before he was in Ozzy's band. Motley Crue is definitely on the heavier side as well, with most, if not all, of their songs being tuned down to D standard, which on bass and guitar is one full step down. And also, Twisted Sister, in my opinion, has much more in common with classic metal like Judas Priest, UFO, Iron Maiden, and Saxon than really anything hair metal related, and I've honestly never considered Twisted Sister to be hair metal. And I would totally argue that Pantera, at least like early 80s Pantera, is metal. And even if you think that 80s Pantera isn't metal, I mean, I don't even need to tell you that Pantera is a metal band. Either way, regardless of what you really got out of this video, I think most metalheads into the scene will argue that, or agree, that hair metal isn't really metal with a few exceptions. And at least it's definitely not metal compared to everything else going on in the metal underground in the 80s. Thrash was born from Wabam, doing British heavy metal, speed metal, and hardcore punk, and thrash would gain momentum and slowly evolve into more extreme genres like death metal, early black metal, and grindcore, along with crossover thrash being a thing, with bands like Suicidal Tendencies and DRI melding thrash with hardcore punk. Anyway, at the end of the day, my opinion is, with a few exceptions, hair metal is not metal. Anyway, you can follow my Instagram and join my Discord server, both are linked in the description, although it will tell you that both are very inactive, so yeah, but if you want to give me a follow, or join the server, go ahead. If you enjoyed, see y'all later.